how to set goals so you're more likely to achieve them. There are ways you can set them where you're less likely to achieve them, and there are ways you can set them where you're more likely to achieve them. And that's what we're talking about here today. There are proven methods that have been used over thousands of my clients personally and over hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people who have used some of these techniques to give themselves a greater assurance that when they set the goals that they will achieve them. So let me start first, since I'm recording this around the time of New Year's, to talk a little bit about the difference between resolutions and goals. And resolutions, I think, is a term that people have kind of overused or perhaps misused, which is when I'm saying, I'm stopping drinking, or I'm not gonna, eat unhealthy anymore, or things like that. And there are these platitudes that people throw out that last usually until about January 17th, surveys show. And that's fine if that's a starting point for somebody. And really what we're talking about here is goals, which is to follow a structured procedure that allows you to think of and imagine and plan for something that you don't have that you will have in the future. Okay, so that's kind of the difference. And I'm not against the idea of resolutions. The resolution, if you look up the word, it means resolve, means it's actually done, it's decided. And that's actually a great step, but it's usually when I'm working with people to set goals, it's the last step that we do, because figure out what you want to have and achieve and define it clearly in some of the things we'll talk about in this video, and then resolve that that's what I'm going to have. So often people jump to that without having the meat behind it. And so when we're talking about setting goals, we first start by talking about the direction of goals. And sometimes people set a goal that's, I don't want to have this. And the problem is the brain doesn't really process, at least the unconscious mind does not process the word not, or it doesn't process easily trying to move away from having something. So one could say, I don't want to be overweight, or one could say, I want to be at a healthier, lower weight. And those two might sound like something the same or very similar. But one is telling you, let's move away from something that I want less of, and the other is saying, let's move towards something that I want more of. And the challenge with trying to move away from something that you want less of is it doesn't tell the brain where to go, right? So if I get into a taxi and they says, hey, where do you want to go? And I'm like, well, anywhere but here. That doesn't tell them where to go, right? So at some point we have to say, okay, it's great we don't want to be here. It's great that you recognize that you have some health issues, some weight issues, whatever. We want to go somewhere, but what does that look like? So, what's the specific weight? What's the time frame, right? So I'm getting into some of the pieces that we'll talk about in a little more detail here. So you can get some motivation from moving away from something that can get you to take the first step, but then we want to directionalize it. So we want to define what it is you specifically want and be able to paint a picture to be able to describe it to somebody, or to get a really solid feeling that, yes, this is what I want. So that's the first step, is define it as something positive and something to move towards, okay? The next one is to be sure that it's appropriately sized. So I encourage people to set big goals, but not so big that they're unrealistic, right? And then it just feels like no matter what they do, they can't make it. So they lose motivation and they fail. They stop trying. So we want to make it big enough that it's motivating and not too big that it's unmotivating. And how do you know that? Which is, you can get a sense of, does it feel overwhelming, or does it feel like this is something I can do? Now, sometimes we just need to adjust the time frame, which is another way that we can manage this. So if you have a big goal and it feels overwhelming, just focus on the first step and the second step and the third step. So part of the goal setting process should be, even if you have this giant goal way off in the future, how do you break it down into some smaller pieces so that the first step doesn't feel overwhelming? It feels whelming, if that's a word, okay? So not too big, not too small, at least in terms of the first steps or the intermediate steps. And again, you can set a giant goal. Just be sure that you've broken it down in a way where you can take those first steps and feel good about that. Now, there are some specific criteria, and you may have heard this if you've done any work around goal setting, which is what they call SMART criteria. SMART is an acronym that stands for specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time-bound. And I'll talk about each one of those here for just a little bit of detail. So specific is that specificity that I mentioned earlier. So if somebody says, well, I want to lose weight, great, that's moving towards something. Or I want to be less anxious or more confident when public speaking. Again, that's moving towards something, especially the more confident, right? But if you talk about something like more confident, like what does that feel like? What does that look like? How are you going to feel when you're standing in front of the audience? What will you notice inside yourself that lets you know that you've gotten this, that you've achieved this, right? It might be, oh, I normally have a very tightness in my chest, and now I'm feeling kind of relaxed in my body, and I can look around at the audience and I can see everybody, and it all, it all just feels good. If it's something like losing weight, it's how much weight specifically and what time frame, and then we get into some hows and things like that. But that's the S in SMART, is the specificity. Measurable goes along with that. So how will you measure your progress? Is it something you can measure through some external observation? So if we're talking about weight loss, what is the measurement? It could be pounds. It could be how you feel just in terms of your energy level. It could be in terms of size of clothing. But we want something that you can measure along the way, because you get what you measure, okay? The A is for achievable. So again, I don't discourage people from setting big goals, but one way to make it achievable is to make sure that it's something within your control. So you can set goals that might depend upon other people, but in the end, it has to be something that's within your control, because you can't control other people, no matter how much we try, how hard we try. So we want it to be achievable, and that means something within your own control. Okay. R is for realistic. So it's fine to say I want $1 million, right? That's a common goal that people have. But if somebody has zero money now and they want $1 million tomorrow, that's not really realistic, right? Now we could say I want $1 million in 5 years, right? So then maybe that means in 3 years you need to have $500,000, for example, right? So this is not to put a limitation on what is possible, it's just what is realistic, right? Because again, if you have zero money and you have like no prospects, or there's no realistic way that the money's going to come in tomorrow, that you're not going to have that $1 million tomorrow. You can again set some goals along the way. You can also understand what it is you want with $1 million, and maybe some other goal might be a better intermediate goal. Okay. And the last one is time bound. So if somebody says I want to lose weight, then the unconscious mind goes, great, we'll do that next year, right? So we'll just leave that as a resolution that carries over to next year, right? But if you say, I want to be at my ideal weight of 180 pounds by June 7th of 2025, right? Then that's something that your brain can focus on, and you can kind of see or get a sense of, or tell yourself that, yes, this is something that is measurable, it's realistic, presumably so, that it's achievable, that you can do it, it's within your control, and then it's time bound, because the mind sometimes needs something to be able to code the time for you. So utilize these tips. This is one of the first things that I do when I'm working with a client. If they're coming in to clear something out like anxiety, because I work a lot with anxiety and stress and things like that, we will still set a goal like, what does your life look like and feel like without that anxiety? What is it like? Do you have confidence? Do you have peace? What are those things? And we kind of run through this fairly quickly. So we begin to code in their unconscious mind, this is what this is like, okay? And if I'm working with somebody in a coaching engagement, then we go much deeper into this. There's only so much we can do in 10 minutes here, but we can go much deeper into each one of these steps. There's some other criteria that we can look at that can help make it more likely for them to achieve it. But this is just a few key points. The SMART criteria, setting things appropriate size, making it time bound will really help you when you're setting your goals. So try it out, and you might find that this just gives a nice framework and a nice structure so that you're more likely to get your goals.